pass the mic over to Kevin first, then Colin, if you could just both introduce yourselves. I'm Taylor, Product Marketing Manager at Malbec, and I'm really excited for the discussion today.
Hey everyone, I'm Kevin Cohn. I'm Chief Customer Officer at Brightflag and a member of the advisory board for legal operators, and also looking forward to the discussion today.
Hi everyone, my name is Colin Levy. I'm Director of Legal and Evangelist for Malbec. You probably also know me from my LinkedIn and social media activity. Really a pleasure to be here with my good friend Kevin and Taylor.
Colin, you're on LinkedIn? I didn't know. No, just kidding. No, Colin has to deal with me teasing him all the time since we're coworkers. But before we dive into the discussion, just want to give a quick overview of what we're hoping to discuss today. So we're talking about really what's happening in the economy today and how legal tech can really help organizations prepare for what's next. And so to cover this pretty meaty topic, we're going to start by talking about how the need for legal tech has really changed over the last few years and why it's needed more than ever today. We're going to get some advice from Colin and Kevin about how do you go about selecting the right tools when there are so many options and the market is incredibly crowded. And then how do you start automating those manual tasks that are maybe taking up a lot of your time, being rooted in process and best practices. We're going to get their thoughts on how to best approach that. And then most importantly, once you are choosing a tool or once you've already implemented a tool, how are you measuring that and ensuring that the whole organization is on board? So I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So first topic, it seems as though legal tech really isn't considered a luxury anymore. It's really a must-have. And, just we all know what's happening in the economy today. A lot of companies have faced, budget cuts. They've been restructuring their teams. Some are even not hiring as often or as quickly anymore. And we can now draw kind of a straight line to how legal tech can really help optimize some of those processes and help organizations do more with less. So, Colin, we'll start with you, but what are your thoughts on this and what are you seeing in the market right now?
Absolutely. Thanks, Taylor. So, really legal tech with respect to helping companies do more with less, I think has been a constant theme even prior to the most recent economic slowdown. And really the way in which it can help is through several things. Number one, it can get you a better handle on how things are currently being done through insights that are data-driven and based off actions you're currently doing. You can automate and therefore spend more time on more strategic tasks and less time on sort of common, routine, standardizable tasks that are time-consuming, but don't really kind of add too much to the business, but nevertheless have to get done. And automating those things can allow you to spend your time more effectively, which is increasingly important as more pressure is on legal departments to spend what budget they do have more wisely and judiciously. In addition, as noted on the slide here, technology can really help with ensuring that revenue you're generating is being protected and is being used appropriately. Again, through data-driven insights driven by tech-based tools. And with that, I will pass it over to Kevin to dive in with regards to his thoughts on this.
Oh boy, so I have a lot of thoughts on this topic, but in the interest of avoiding it being me and Colin just evangelizing legal technology the entire time, because I enjoy listening to Colin talk, and I enjoy nothing more than listening to myself talk, but you might not love listening to the two of us do that. So I'll take a sort of counter approach to this. I'll tell you a story about so I'm responsible for all go-to-market at Brightflag, marketing, alliances, sales, and customer success. And our director of revenue operations, she and I have worked together for a very long time. And revenue operations, very analogous to legal operations, and RevOps technology, very analogous in many ways to legal ops technology. Revenue operations software helps go-to-market teams to be more efficient, to get more visibility, to make better decisions, to reduce risk, all of these things. So there are a lot of parallels. And she and I will talk all the time about how if we're going to add something new to our tech stack, then we have to take something away. All right. It's that check and balance against constantly saying, okay, what's the new technology that we're going to add? Now, we don't literally take something away every time that we go to add something, but it's that forcing function to slow down and say, okay, there's this category that exists. In the case of legal operations, legal tech is the macro category, and within that, there are all of these individual things that you might, need or think that you need. So Colin Taylor and the Malbec team do contract lifecycle management. Brightflag does e-billing and matter management. There are a dozen other legal tech categories. At large, I don't think that legal tech is a must-have. I think individual solutions to individual problems may, depending on your circumstance, where your organization is, where the legal team is in its maturity journey, they may over time become must-haves. But that's the way that we tend to think about it from a revenue operations perspective. And it's the way that I encourage most legal operations professionals to think about it, is not, okay, we've got, CLM and e-billing, what's next? Is it document management or this other thing? Because, you have to keep expanding your use of technology. It's what are the, 2 to 3 most important problems that my legal team is facing right now and I have to solve, and how might technology play a role in solving that problem? So, ultimately it lands on some of the same, outcomes, which is legal tech does give you visibility. It makes your team more productive. It helps you to get more value out of the investments that you're making. But I don't think that it should actually be, an automatic. I think that there's a lot of diligence and careful consideration that goes into making these decisions.
That's a great point. And, I'm really looking forward to digging into that more, what you just said about finding what is wrong with your process or what you hope to improve about your process before simply selecting a tool, right? It's not a Band-Aid solution. It definitely needs to have that purpose built in before you select a tool. And before we get off of this topic, though, just something to layer in here, what about companies that are trying to retain the talent they have or are currently recruiting? I mean, how can some of these tools help bring new people or keep people into the fold when it comes to these important processes? Can you talk a little bit about that? I think there's another side of it where we need these tools to keep business as usual through change.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share some thoughts on that. So the workforce is getting younger. Corporate legal departments, I think, somewhat for good reason, they have this stereotype, this aura of being kind of stodgy, the Department of No. In the context of contract management, for example, salesperson's favorite thing to say about legal is it's where my deals go to die.
Yep.
So that reputation exists, and in some cases it's deserved, in other cases it isn't. But what's happening is the workforce is getting younger, and so there's this very clear dividing line of people who have been doing this work for a long time, and they've been doing it without the benefit of modern technology, and that's sort of what they're used to. We had a great session on change management last week, and the head of legal ops for Cresco Labs was talking about just how difficult change is, especially if the longer you've been doing it, the harder it is to change. But then there's this younger cohort, and they grew up using mobile devices, they grew up using cloud software, and so the sort of starkest divide, that the great test is, if it was entirely up to you, would you use Microsoft Word or Google Docs? The Google Docs generation is taking up a larger percentage of corporate legal teams, and they just have an expectation that in order to do their job well and to enjoy doing it, they're going to have modern software that supports them. And so it becomes increasingly difficult to attract, retain, and develop that younger generation of talent if you're not giving them the tools that they've come to expect.
Right.
Yeah. And Colin, from your perspective in, being on a legal team with just yourself, right? Like on a smaller legal team, how do you see technology helping you kind of button up your process and also keep you out of those manual time-consuming tasks so that you can focus on those more strategic and value add projects?
Right. So technology for me in terms of my ability to help support the other parts of the business and the other functions is ensuring that the tools I'm using are ones that I'm not the only one using, but are ones that are collaborative and I can work alongside other functions while using, for example, contract management, but also plenty of other tools as well. Because increasingly, what businesses need to be able to do all the time and effectively is collaborate, regardless of where your employees are physically located. And technology can really help achieve that. And to Kevin's point with respect to using modern tools, really the way I think to attract and retain employees with respect to technology is understand them, understand their backgrounds, understand how they work, and provide tools that are aligned to how they do their best work. And so that really goes back to something Kevin said earlier, which is with respect to diligence, really doing a due diligence on your own company, understanding your lay of the land, and then using that understanding to figure out, okay, what outcomes am I seeking to achieve based off of the reality on the ground? And how does tech fit into that puzzle or not fit into that puzzle? Because again, technology is not something you just want to rush out into and just buy whatever the slickest piece of tech out there is. It really should be something that is very specifically attuned to whatever outcome you're seeking to achieve, whether it's on the employee level or on a larger business level.
Absolutely. And we have a great comment in the chat, kind of reinforcing what you both have said from Jason, just saying that, some may suggest that calling a CLM legal tech is actually somewhat limiting because it really is enterprise technology. And that just folds right into what you both have said about legal being at the center of the organization and partnering with other business units to achieve a common goal. So with that, I will move on, but we'd love to hear from you in the chat. If you have any questions, I'd love to be able to send them up to the panel. So starting at the top, and we've kind of already started touching on some of this, but when it comes to selecting the right tool, I will use CLM as an example. If I were to type in right now, CLM solution into Google, it would be overwhelming the amount of options I would have, the amount of competitors that there are in the space, all saying that they're the best. And so it's really difficult, even though it's easy to find solutions, it's difficult to find the right one for you. And I think that, the goal of this discussion is really, what are some of those guiding points that we can give people as they're doing their own research? And so a couple of the points I want to touch on is when it comes to measuring that value that the solution provides and calculating the cost. I think cost is on everyone's mind right now, knowing what's going on with the economy, what most budgets are facing. But Colin, can you talk a little bit about just that first point? What advice do you have for someone who may be weighing the cost of doing nothing, right? Maybe not optimizing the process, not finding a tool, and maybe what that benefit is and the long-term return?
Sure. So it starts again to something that I think both Kevin and I touched on earlier, which is kind of understanding your reality and understanding where the pain points are and why those pain points exist, and then figuring out how to resolve those pain points. Because going forward, as there's increased pressure to do more with less and to be more efficient and more productive, you want to see if you can kind of eliminate some of those pain points, because those are likely costing your company real dollars over the long term. And so you want to see what can be done to lower those costs, and whether that means investing in tech, or whether it means looking at a process and trying to improve it that way first, really, I think can help inform you as to what you should be doing. So in other words, you want to look at the reality and then look at what you want to achieve, whether it is, again, depending on what the problem is. So you want the problem to help define what the solution is, and not the other way around, because there often is a tendency, I think, to be attracted to a solution because it just looks cool and is awesome. It's like a cat, chasing after a set of shiny keys. Apologies to all cats out there. But really, that is, I think, an important consideration is knowing what your problem is, and then understanding how best to solve that problem. Because the problem is, there's definitely a cost to do nothing, but there is also a cost of doing something, but not the right something. So you want to make sure that whatever that something is is aligned to whatever the problem is. And I'm sure, there's plenty of stories I could tell about going out there and, understand I have a problem and then realizing that I really need a solution quickly and letting that pressure to find something quickly kind of define what the solution is. And that can often skew what the results are over the long term. And I certainly have lived that myself a few times. And that's something to keep in mind when you're kind of figuring out what you want to do with respect to changing how things currently are, understanding that there's a cost to doing nothing and there's also a cost to changing things.
Totally. And those are great points. I also just have to say, my favorite thing about you, Colin, is that you could be talking about budget and cost, and you could still make a cat analogy, which, how do you not love that? But over to you, Kevin. I wanted to get your thoughts on that second point, because, as you well know, being in charge of go-to-market, there's so much noise out there about, every legal tech company and how investable they are and how much money they've raised and what series they're on. And there's a lot of industry talk and hype. But what advice do you have for helping people really learn more about how customers are, if they're satisfied, how they're measuring value, how they're seeing impact from a solution? How do you help them filter out that noise to make a really sound decision?
Yeah. So, companies, venture-backed companies talk about how much money they've raised for one of three reasons. Or startups talk about things like how much money they've raised, how many awards they've won, how many people they've hired, for one of three reasons. Number one, insecurity. They're insecure about their own position in the market, and it makes them feel better. I don't think that it actually helps, but it makes them feel better. Number two, all of your competitors are doing it. And so if you don't do it, then buyers start to wonder why not. That's not a good reason, but it's true. The third reason, and I think that this one is legitimate. The third reason is that the perceived biggest risk of going with an early stage company is that it might not be around long enough to see the project through to success, right? And Salesforce, which is now a multi-billion-dollar market cap company, multi-billion-dollar market cap company, for years had to fight this uphill battle. And so Salesforce would constantly talk about how much money they're raising, how many awards that they've won, to create an aura, not of invincibility, but of survivability, of viability. And so I think that a lot of legal tech companies sort of fall into the trap of talking about themselves a whole lot, more as a defense mechanism than an offense mechanism, even though to you as a buyer, it may not seem that way. But to answer the question, how can you go about validating the success that real customers are having? This is an area in which the legal operators community really shines. There are these events that you can go to. There's a Slack work group that you can join. And at least once a day, somebody in that Slack work group is saying, hey, it just happened last week. I saw this message. I'm looking to solve this particular problem. It happened to be about CLM, although it frequently is about other things. I'm looking to solve this particular problem from a contract management perspective. And can anyone reach out to me who has had experience solving this problem? Or, and this person also said, with this vendor, or this vendor, because they're the ones that I'm looking at. And a few people jumped in and said, hey, I've got experience using that myself. I've heard this thing. And more than one person dropped their email in and said, just reach out to me and I'm happy to talk to you. So communities like Legal Operators, like Clock, like the legal operations chapters of ACC are really fantastic places to go and get that feedback. Online forums like G2, G2.com are also great places to go because they validate that the people writing the reviews are actually current customers. And I've found that their algorithm does a pretty good job of separating the sort of 2-sentence reviews that the vendors induced people to write versus the passionate ones that actually provide a lot of detail. And so those are two things that I would recommend that anybody in the market do to understand, are the solutions that they're looking at actually going to be able to deliver on solving the key problems that they have in front of them.
Absolutely. No, that's putting the customer experience first. And yeah, that's so important and being able to get that real feedback. And then yes, huge shout out to Colin McCarthy and Legal Operators, because this community is amazing and it really is a great starting point for a lot of these discussions to happen. It's a great point. So I'd like both your thoughts on the last point. We'll start with you, Colin, but you know, this is another one of those terms we hear all the time: intuitive, intuitive, intuitive. But often a lot of legal technology tools were made intuitive for legal teams originally, right? But we talked about this a little bit, but moving towards the doing more with less type of scenario. How do we make sure that the tools that we are acquiring are actually built for more than just legal, knowing that there are so many people involved in these processes we're talking about, right? Even just, Kevin, your experience of collaborating with revenue operations, getting a really good grip on your sales cycles, that kind of thing. So how do you make sure that a tool is really more than just intuitive and it's actually collaborative and it creates a shared workspace for all of these business units to come together?
Sure. So I think first of all, there has to be an understanding with respect to some legal tech tool that you're looking at, that the users are the most important group you want to be have evaluating and looking at whatever tool you're considering. And what that means is those usually are people beyond just the decision maker who's actually going to write the proverbial check for the tool. And so you want to have those people involved early in the process, looking at the tool, testing it out, seeing whether it works for them, because you want this tool to be used by the users, because that's where the value of the tool comes from, is from it's being used by the users who often work across different functions. So I would say that, that doesn't mean that the tool shouldn't be intuitive. It just means that intuitive should mean something that's intuitive for a larger group of people across functions, and not just for one specific group, whether it's lawyers or some other group. And with respect to lawyers, I happen to be one. Lawyers are a little bit crazy, and they sometimes like things in a way that may not work for everyone, and hell, may not even work for them, and they don't even know it. So I think there's real importance in ensuring, when you're evaluating a tool, that you have the right people evaluating it at every step of the process. And just because one person happens to be the decision maker and has decided upon evaluating 3 tools out of 12 based off of an RFP, once you reach those 3, include all the people, or at least representatives of the different groups that are going to be using the tool in the evaluation process, to ensure that it's one they like, that it's one that's collaborative for them and provides the functionality that they're looking for, and that ultimately help make their jobs easier. And so I really think that's the key point to emphasize, is ensuring that you're looking at a broader array of folks other than just the decision maker when you're evaluating a tool, because often, again, the decision maker may actually not even be one of the users. It just happens to be someone who decides what type of tech tool the company needs.
Yeah, and before anybody comes for Colin in the chat, he can say lawyers are crazy, because he is one. So we'll give him a pass on that. But no, I totally agree with what you said about bringing in stakeholders early so that they understand the needs that you're solving for and they can actually share their perspective. Kevin, it sounds like you have kind of a process for that. You talked a little bit earlier about, working with your revenue operations leader and, trying to establish what the needs are first. Can you talk a little bit about how you get buy-in from other stakeholders during that process?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think that this whole idea of software being intuitive is a bit misleading. There are the rare examples. Zoom, Zoom does one thing. You click one button, all of a sudden you see faces and you hear voices, except maybe on this particular webinar where some people are having trouble hearing us. Like it's, there's just not a lot to it, right? But when we're talking about the types of technology that corporate legal departments are looking to bring on board, outside counsel management, contract lifecycle management, e-discovery, these are complex problems. And I don't deny that some solutions in a category are easier to use than other solutions in the category. But I think for the most part, intuitive means you're accustomed to it. And if you're not already using the category, then you are not going to find it intuitive. And if you're already using a different product in the category, then not only will you find the potential successor not intuitive, you will find it counterintuitive because it works in a different way than the product that you're accustomed to. So, so when we're looking to bring on board software, in the sort of revenue operations space, but our customers, who are all legal operations professionals, encounter the same thing when they're, for example, considering bringing Brightflag on board. We find that it's a mistake to ask, how intuitive do you find this to be, or how easy do you find this to be to use? Because you're gonna get some people that are champions, and they're like gung ho, any kind of change, any kind of technology, anything that leaves the status quo behind, they're all for it. But you're more likely to get people that are sticks in the mud and say, don't touch it. You might have a problem with how things are going, but I don't, and I don't want you to rock the boat at all. So internally, we actually ask the opposite question. All right. We ask, where do you think this is going to cause you to struggle? Right? If we were to do this, where do you think that you're going to get stuck? And people are much more willing to tell you where they think they're going to get stuck. And it serves a few purposes. Number one, it flushes out that most people, and they're not being disingenuous, they're not meaning to be combative, but they may not have internalized that they're being sticks in the mud. And so where do you expect to get stuck? Here it comes, and you can say, hey, let's work through that. Why do you think that this is going to be a step back? Help me to better understand it. The second is that it doesn't matter how many people you include on your buying committee. Buying anything is a very aspirational process. Nobody buys something out of necessity. I mean, I've been selling software or supporting software for 17 years, my entire career. Nobody buys based on need. Everybody buys based on desire, and then they rationalize the desire with facts, right? That's how buying works. That's the psychology of buying things. So by asking them for the pain, you are actually forcing them to think about how things might not work, and your ultimate selection will be better as a result, right? I can't tell you the number of times that we've gotten an RFP, and RFPs are all written the same way. Someone says, let's create the RFP. They email, 10, 15, 100 different people and say, what questions do you want to ask? And they all send back the questions, and they get stacked together in this giant document. And the reason that I know with certainty that this is how it happens is, well, number one, people tell you. But number two, the same question gets asked 5 different times in 5 slightly different ways. But the questions end up being aspirational. The questions don't say, we need to accomplish this very specific thing. And these are the constraints that we have because of our enterprise technology stack or because of our compliance requirements, whatever it is. And how does your product work in that respect, right? If you ask people, where might this break? They're going to say, oh my God, this element of our compliance process is a disaster. And I'm concerned about turning something on that's going to impact it. And now all of a sudden you can actually talk to the vendors about that particular thing, and they probably have some experience with it. So I flip it, right? I don't ask intuitive. I assume it's not.
No, that's really insightful, actually. And I think you're spot on. The desire for change really has to be greater than the pain of the process they're currently facing. And we have a really great comment in the chat from Jason again, just, finding common pains across stakeholders is important. Otherwise, you select and implement a system based on the squeaky wheel stakeholder, and it's not really intuitive for others. So yeah, I think you're spot on, Jason. I think that's a great add. And with that, we can move on unless there are other questions on that slide.
Can I, Taylor, can I interrupt and just add one more thing to what Kevin said?
Of course, please.
Well, first of all, I think that Kevin kind of essentially speaks to something that is common, I think, across humanity, which is people like to complain. They do. They like to complain. So if you give them an opportunity to complain in a valuable way, that can be really helpful for you. because it makes them feel heard, if you will. I often talk about meeting people where they are, and often that really means shutting up and listening to what people are complaining about and hearing how they're describing what they're complaining about, and then responding accordingly with whatever you're trying to get them to buy into, pardon the pun there. So I really think that Kevin makes a good point there.
No, yeah, that's a great way to wrap it up too. And listening is really important at that selection stage, just so you know that all the right people are on board and that there is buy-in before you get too far down that road. I think that's really essential. So we're going to talk about automation a little bit next, and that's a big buzzword. Some people will roll their eyes at it, some people won't. But really, when I think about automation and what it means, especially for legal teams and legal operations leaders, it's about alleviating burdens and manual tasks. That's really all it is. It's easier said than done, but we've kind of already started going down this road of talking about assembling a launch team of cross-functional stakeholders. But let's move to that second point. So when it comes to actually assessing your current processes and defining those requirements, Colin, where do you start? Because there can be so many processes in place already, and you may not even feel that they need improving yet. So how do you actually identify what tasks are burdening your team so that you can actually free up some of their time?
Sure. Well, I think to answer that question, it starts with starting incrementally. In other words, looking at smaller processes that nevertheless have different steps and potentially have pain points associated with different steps of that process, and then figuring out what can be done to improve those pain points. It could be, for example, I often think that one of the biggest pain points for legal departments often can be intake. Someone has a so-called quick question, which, to be honest with you, is never quick. And they ask, so I'm thinking about this. I'd like to do this. What are your thoughts on that? Well, that can happen through an off-the-cuff conversation or through an email or what have you. But it really, I think that's something that can be automated, meaning that you have someone submit a request, and yeah, it takes a little bit of the personality out of it, but it allows you to document exactly what it is that they need, and then allows them to track the processing of that request from start to finish. So that's one thing that you could possibly, look at automating. It allows you to collect data and allows you to make the process a little more standardizable, a little more routine and faster, rather than sort of these off-the-cuff conversations, which nevertheless may likely happen anyway. But at least if you can get it documented, that can help you better respond as needed to those pesky quick questions which come up. The other thing I would add is when you're looking at sort of automating something, you need to understand, why do you want to automate this? Is it simply because you just think automating is a cool thing, which it is? That's great, but that's not going to help solve your problem. You need to understand, is this process appropriate for automating? Meaning that, is there something in this process that you can take the human out of and have done through either completion of a form or what have you? Because you don't want to automate something that can't be, well, I don't want to say it can't be automated, but really is not suitable for automation. And there often is a tendency to think that anything can be automated, and it's not really true. It really depends on exactly what it is that you're trying to achieve and why automation is going to help you achieve that. And that starts with kind of understanding an existing process that's very well defined and fairly granular, and defining sort of each different step in that process. And then within those steps, what steps potentially tech can help with. And sometimes that may be, you may not actually have a process, which could be a problem because perhaps there is a need for a process. But you want to make sure that just because you have a need for a process doesn't mean that process necessarily dictates it being automated. So I would make that distinction there.
Yeah, and I think to your point, automation doesn't discriminate, right? You can automate a good process and you can automate a bad process, and
Exactly.
That's just the reality, right? So Kevin, what are your thoughts on this, and how, what advice do you have for helping people actually understand what needs automation and what maybe doesn't, because I think that that gets a little murky really quickly.
Yeah. So I'll again tell a story about something that we've worked through at Bright Flag, but worked through internally, because I don't want to sit here and talk about our product. So, I agree with what the two of you have said so far. I'll use a different word. Technology is a force multiplier. It can be a force multiplier for good. It can be a force multiplier for bad. And so, when we're working on technology projects internally, whether it's, assistance that we're looking to provide through technology or automation, the distinction that I draw there is automation, I consider that to be taking the human out entirely, whereas assistance just makes, they're completing their task easier. We're looking first and foremost at direction of travel, vector. And then after that, we're looking at thrust. So how quickly are we moving in that direction? And if you're moving in the wrong direction and you apply maximum thrust, then you're going to wind up in a worse position than you are now. So very small, humble brag. We've been really successful at Bright Flag over the last few years. We've added a ton of customers. And recently, our customer success team has started to encounter this problem where the number of customers that are approaching their contractual usage limits and need to go through, a commercial negotiation is increasing. And we were doing this manually in every sense of the word. The customer success managers were having to individually check each customer's level of use. You can imagine that if a customer success manager has, 20 to 40 customers that they're supporting, that's 20 to 40 times that they need to go and run these reports and compare it to the contract usage limit, which they need to pull out of a contract. So they need to find the contract, pull it out, run the report, compare the two, and then extrapolate, are they going to go over the limit? And if so, by how much? And then consult the pricing and decide what's the right thing to do here. So this is happening more and more. And we say, okay, we actually can't do it anymore. It's not possible. We're just falling behind. The customers are finding out after the fact that they're over their contract limits. Nobody likes a surprise, even if it means that they're not actually being charged, what they should be paying, and they're saving money. So we set out to break down the problem, and we walked through, recognizing that a customer was using the product all the way down to the finer details of, sometimes we get this objection or that objection or the other objection, and how do we respond to those, those asks during negotiation. And we tried to find what we felt was the critical issue, where we were really getting stuck. And what we concluded was where we're getting stuck is that we are behind the 8 ball. We come to understand too late that the customer's use of the product is changing, and we need to initiate a conversation. So that is the particular component of the process that we chose to focus on rolling out some technology-aided assistance. So not automation. We're not using technology to automatically email the customer and say this, that, and the other thing, or to automatically generate, a new order form for them to sign. We're surfacing the relevant information to the success manager at the right time, and then providing them with some enablement material that they can use. So it's saving them a lot of time, and it's putting them in a position where they're not trying to play catch up, right? So there are tons of other opportunities that we identified for technology to provide assistance, and opportunities for technology to fully automate certain elements of this process. But we concluded that they were not necessary right now to solve the main issue that the business was facing. So, to translate this to legal ops, whether you're engaging outside counsel or you're trying to partner with your sales team or your procurement team to streamline contracts, whatever it is, the process as you sort of conceptualize it is, as Colin said, a series of these discrete steps, activities, actions. Find the one that is actually going to make the difference between success and failure, and go to work on that one, and just not literally ignore the rest of them, but significantly deprioritize the rest of them, and
Yeah.
you'll come back to it when it becomes the long pole.
Yeah,
Right.
and you make a really great point about something. I think that automation gets a bad rap because too many people think, well, automation means we're taking the human out of the process. Well, but really, it's about building a system that you can scale that allows your team to assume smart risks or smarter risks so that you're not always, reinventing the wheel. So I think that that's a really good distinction to make. And I totally agree with your point in the chat as well, Colin, about if you're automating that's something that's really not suitable for that, then you might be creating a new problem that didn't exist before, and that isn't very helpful either. So I think both great points made. Any additional thoughts or questions from the audience on this before we move on?
In the meantime, while we're waiting for questions, I just wanted to share another thought, which is, I think, oftentimes the difference maker can be seemingly the smallest thing that you've changed, because size of change does not have a direct relationship to impact. Oftentimes, the smaller the change, the bigger the impact. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the other thing that I would suggest is you want to differentiate between symptoms and the actual problem. Sometimes symptoms masquerade as the problem when they're just symptoms of a larger problem. So you really want to kind of understand exactly what the issue is. And that means oftentimes tearing apart a process and looking at it as these discrete steps so you can understand sort of what are symptoms and what are actual problems.
That's a good distinction, and it can be really hard to pull those layers back, but it's really important that teams do that before they, like you said, build that new process and put that into place. So
yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is, people want to sometimes jump straight to technology, and that's I think a dangerous proposition where you really need to do sort of this perhaps not so glamorous but super important work of really looking at your processes and your people before moving to tech, because tech is kind of like a really super bright flashlight, and if you certainly sort of turn it on, you may not see what you want to be seeing, or you may see things you're not expecting to see. So it's really important to kind of know what you're doing before you flip that switch.
absolutely. Yeah. So we're already running out of time, but this is kind of our last big topic before we take some questions and wrap this up. But now that, we've talked about getting the right solution, implementing it for the right processes and reasons, now how do we evaluate that, right? I think that legal operations teams are often tasked with, really maximizing efficiency, and they're expected to bring, those tangible results to the larger business table and say, this is what we're seeing. This is how we're improving our process. So I'm just going to leave this one open because you both have plenty of experience with this, both in your respective roles and also, implementing tools yourself. What are some key best practices or, for evaluating a tool's ROI? And Kevin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm just sort of scrolling through, the attendee names, and a lot of names I recognize, some I don't, but a lot that I do. And quite a few of you are, if my memory serves, originating your company's legal ops function. Many of you are in your first formal legal ops role, to say nothing of originating the function. And so I have to imagine that even in the best of times, going to your GC or your CFO and saying, hey, let's spend however much money on something that this company has never spent money on before, that can be a difficult thing. It can be an intimidating thing. It could be the kind of thing where you feel like, the CFO is telling everyone they have to spend less and we can't hire and money is really tight. I might lose my job if I say, actually, I think we need to spend money. So before you even think about what the ROI of this category or that category, or this vendor in this category or that vendor in the same category might be, I think you first need to establish internally that the cost of inaction, which Taylor, you had on a previous slide, is too great to ignore. right? Because what I think a lot of legal ops professionals can probably, this experience will resonate with them. They go off to their GC or the CFO or whomever and say, I think that we should explore getting X. And the very first question that you get is, well, what would be the ROI of X? And I think you are immediately in a bit of a hole at that point, right? I think you're in a much stronger position if you're able to say, I observe this problem in the business, and this is how I think it's costing us in quantifiable terms by not doing anything. Do we agree on the problem set without even mentioning tech or spending more money? Just quantify the impact of this business as usual, continuing to be business as usual. Once you've agreed that there's a cost of inaction, then you can go off and start to debate the return on making an investment to attack that problem, right? And of course, the ROI has to exceed the COI, the cost of inaction. In terms of actually sort of stress testing individual vendors' ROI claims, I mean, the truth is, I think it's not possible. I think that if you have confidence in what your costs of inaction are, and if you have done the diligence to understand what a solution in this space, not this vendor solution or that vendor solution, could do to address the cost of inaction, anything beyond that is a lot of guesswork or a lot of sales on the part of the vendor. It's not that vendors are being misleading to you, and I certainly don't think that most vendors are lying about it. But I think the reality is that there's a fair bit of guesswork involved. All right, and it's much easier to establish the true cost of inaction than it is to get a solid figure on what the return would be on an investment.
I totally agree with that approach. And, before I pass over to you, Colin, I'll just share kind of an example that I keep hearing about. So I think that in order for you to really make an impact with that conversation that you're having with your general counsel or whoever it is, or your CFO, you need to be able to tie that cost of inaction to a greater business goal. So, I mean, we hear a lot of companies say, well, we really need to be more strict about our spending. We need to optimize our revenue processes. Well, a great example of that in terms of contract management is if you don't even know what's in your contracts and you're not actually tracking those obligations, you're trying to do that manually, then you might be losing a lot of money from those contracts. Like, that's a great example. Can you quantify the loss and how that's actually contributing to that greater problem? That's just one example that I keep hearing about. And so, since we're sharing stories, I don't know, Colin, can you relate to that? And what are you seeing as you work with, legal teams and others?
Yeah, absolutely. So earlier in my career, I saw a need to have a tech tool, but I was pretty fresh out of law school. It was one of my first in-house roles. And at the time, I didn't really see what Kevin spoke about, which was the need to kind of make the cost of inaction argument. So I went ahead and said, hey, so, I think we've got a problem here. I would like to try to solve it with B and C. And the response back was, well, we think you're doing a good enough job as it is, so we don't see a need for you to, change up what you're doing. And I took that as sort of like, well, on the one hand, I'm glad you think I'm doing a good job, but on the other hand, it's a really struggle for me to do that good job that you're seeing. And so I think really to Kevin's point, data is really important to tell a story with, not just when you have a tech tool, but more importantly, prior to getting a tech tool. In other words, really quantifying, as Kevin noted, the cost of inaction, and really pointing out that this is not just a problem that impacts me. This is actually a broader problem that impacts the business, because it really, too often, I think people make the mistake of framing something as a problem that's theirs and theirs alone. And if that's the case, frankly, no one really cares if it's just your problem. That's your problem. You deal with it yourself. But if you can make the case that it's actually a broader business problem and say, here's why, because it's impacting X, Y, and Z, and these different functions and this amount, then someone's going to pay attention and say, oh, yeah, you're right. We probably want to do something about that and start going on down that road. And I completely agree with Kevin. I think that, companies do talk a lot about ROI, but the set of facts that determine ROIs are very sensitive to specific customer use cases. So just the extent to which, those ROI numbers are out there, I think that is good, but ultimately, the cost of inaction, I think, is the far better approach to make the case over the long term for tech tools than saying, hey, we should get this tool and it will, improve, X, Y, or Z, 75%, without really having too much to back that up with, frankly.
Yeah, very good point. I mean, it's been a pleasure asking you both questions, but I do feel like I've had the mic for way too long. So I want to make sure that in our last, 7 minutes or so, that if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I would love to ask the panel. Any final thoughts or closing thoughts from either of you? I know we've covered a lot of ground and I really appreciate your insights.
I guess the last thing I would say, and I will try to think of a way to not make this sound self-serving. One of the things that I think a lot of legal departments struggle with, and I mentioned this earlier, is being seen as the department of no, where deals go to die. A cost center, a black box. If we were all in a room together, I'd say, raise your hand if you haven't heard your team be described in one of these ways, and the room would be silent and nobody would raise their hand. And I'm of the opinion that one of the essential reasons why that is the case is actually down to mindset, right? It's not a lack of respect that other people in the business have for legal. It's down to mindset. If every time you're asked, how much is this going to cost or how long this is going to take, the answer is, I don't know, someone else is telling me it needs to be done. Legal doesn't originate the work. We just respond to the work. Then, I don't agree with it, but I can understand why you are seen as the service organization. And so, in our view, the first step in getting out of that is to pull the conversations forward. If you want to be seen as, an essential part of the business, as you are, right? This isn't a changing of reality. This is a changing of perception. Then get involved earlier. Most organizations are kicking off their annual planning process right now, right? So the budget is getting set. And the best way to make sure that legal has the right budget for the year is to go to all of the different executives in the business and say, what are your investments for the year? What are your business plans? Every single expense in a business is a function of some other business driver. How much you're going to spend with outside counsel on employment matters, for example, is a function of how many people you expect to employ and how many and what you expect your retention rate to be, et cetera. And these things are not secrets. There's a hiring plan that's built, and you can build the employment outside counsel expense budget on top of that. If you don't actively involve yourself in these strategic decisions, and you instead say, we're the service organization, we react to what comes up, then you're going to be in trouble, right? So that's the outside counsel angle. If I were to apply the same argument to, the space that Malbec is in, contract management, big use for contract management is streamlining sales contract negotiations. I guarantee you that the head of sales at your organization has a plan for how much revenue they're going to add, how many customers they're going to add, and you can leverage historical data to say, okay, this is how many commercial contracts attorneys we're going to need in order to support you. And if you want your deals to close quickly, then this is the budget that we're going to need. So now is the time to have those conversations now is the time to look at, the profile of outside counsel spends, the hiring plans for the legal department, and tie each of these things back to the core business drivers, rather than try to say, hey, buy our software because it has 10x ROI, right?
Mhm.
Or sorry, rather than say, let's buy this software because it will have 10x ROI. Switched personas there for a minute. So that's my sort of closing comment.
No, I totally agree with everything you said. Super valuable. And I appreciate you joining and sharing all of your insights. It's been awesome to hear your perspective. Colin, what about you? Anything you want to add?
So I'll just sum up kind of what I think Kevin was getting at, which is that numbers matter, metrics matter, data matters, and you want to make sure you have the right data at your hands to make the decisions you need to make. None of the stuff that Kevin spoke to, none of the valuable data that you should have at your fingertips to make decisions are secrets. It's just a matter of getting that information, and having tools to get that information is important. And I keep telling legal departments that I speak to and the lawyers in those legal departments that, hate to break it to you, not really, but you got to speak the language of business. The language of business is metrics, it's data, and that means yes, numbers. And so you really need to be comfortable with that in order to make the case internally for new tools, to make the case for change more generally. Frankly, to show your value, frankly, to the business, you need to be able to do that by telling a story using data, and the tools that both Kevin and I represent are some of the tools that can help you get there. And I realize it's a little bit self-serving, but it's also frankly true. And so that would be the main point I would like to leave everyone with.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm going to try to not sound self-serving now too. We all get our moment, right? But next week on Thursday, I'm giving a high-level product tour of Malbec. I'd love to get to know more of you, see you there. If you're just interested in seeing, what our solution does or has to offer, I will throw the link in the chat. And I just want to thank everyone for your engagement and your questions. It's been awesome to be a part of this discussion, and it's always great hanging out with you too. So thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. Thanks, Colin. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Before we jump off, I will be self-serving, and I will say, I'm very familiar with Malbec, and this is definitely something I would do a product tour on. If I was in the morning, if I'm picking a CLM system, this is probably on number one on my list that I'm looking at for many reasons. And I hope you guys engage with Taylor and Malbec. Thank you very much, guys. Excellent panel. Great questions.
Thank you, Colin, and thanks both of you. Have a
Thanks,
great day.
everyone. Take care.
Thank you.